So if I was to condense down all of the information related to gender identity and the transgender population, I can say it in one word, and that is resiliency. Resiliency. So I first became interested in this topic of the transgender community in around 2015. This is when just the general awareness was increased. Caitlyn Jenner had just come out. There was a Time magazine article, The Transgender Tipping Point. Laverne Cox as a trans actress was becoming very popular. So the visibility had increased. And I was reminded of an individual who I knew back in the 1990s when I was in college. As an undergraduate, I had a professor, a male professor that I really admired. And then I worked with the same individual, and she had transitioned, was working with me. We even co-founded a Women in Science organization. Things started to get difficult with the politics, and this was around in 2016. So the visibility happened in the early 2000s, and then in 2016, really with the way that the politics went, the legislation started where it was really targeting the transgender community. And so I felt led to become an advocate, and doing that through learning and through scholarship. I decided to go back to school for a PhD. My background is in biology. I decided to go into the social sciences. And so I felt that that was a skill set that I could then bring to protecting the marginalized community as the transgender population. So I am now currently working on a PhD in cultural foundations of education, and my dissertation will be on this topic. I have been in school now for 2 years, almost done with my coursework, and my intent is to document. We are actually seeing a diaspora of families that are essentially moving out of areas that are not safe for them politically, and so I'm hoping to document that in some way. The media really has pushed a lot of this. The visibility is somewhat of a double-edged sword. It's called even a trap door within the literature. Because they're more visible, they're more targeted. And so we have a lot of bullying that is happening in schools. And Next Benedict is an example of that, where bullying led to some altercation and then to a death of a young trans child. I'm a volunteer with the Trans Allies of Ohio, and that volunteership means that I'm down at the State House doing testimony, advocating for the trans population. And in doing that, I've walked alongside many families, and they are tired. There's so much targeting being done right now, and families, there's real world ramifications to that. These families have to make a decision. Do they make the trip down to Columbus to spend the day advocating for their child, or do they go to work and make a paycheck? Those decisions, everyday decisions, become very difficult. It is a journey for any parent to come to an understanding of what a child is dealing with when they are gender non-conforming, or if they are dealing with some gender issues. That understanding is difficult for a parental group to look at and move forward with, and making good decisions for them socially and medically. And adding on top of that all of this legislation, which really is, it's intentional by the politicians to put this legislation in place to make it so uncomfortable for these families that they either leave the state or they make decisions not to make decisions in the best interest of their own family. And it's all about conforming to what society wishes to happen, which is that transgender people would just go away. We'll lean into a quote that was given by a senator in Ohio during the legislation for House Bill 68, which is the healthcare ban. And this is an actual quote. She said, "You cannot affirm what does not exist." Politicians and those who support this legislation wish that these children, who then grow up into adulthood, wish that they did not exist. And I want to share another quote from a trans child who has been interviewed numerous times, who has given testimony at the State House numerous times. She's 16 years old. She transitioned when she was young. She was in a Catholic school and she was thrown out of school. But this is her response to a quote like that from a senator. "I'm a woman and I don't really care what they think. I will forever be a girl." And that is very typical of the transgender population. Gender identity emerges in a transgender child just as much as it does in a gender nonconforming child. And this is actually the research that I do. I work in early childhood development, and am looking at a set of data right now with an international team of researchers. And so that quote really does capture this group of individuals. They know from a young age that they are transgender. They may not have language until they get older and they learn or when their body starts to change during adolescence, they become more aware. We can ask them to conform to societal norms and not be or express themselves as transgender, but that doesn't change that they are transgender. So if I was to condense down all of the information related to gender identity and the transgender population, I can say it in one word, and that is resiliency. This population has been around for centuries. It's documented in antiquities. We have the health care that's been documented since the early 1900s was when the first surgeries were done. So there is a long history of this community thriving, living, walking among us, oftentimes what we call stealth, where we don't know anything about their background, but they still exist. And so that resiliency is what brings me hope. This community, in spite of the targeting that is happening right now, they are thriving. And because of the targeting, they want to make a difference. They are going to school to become lawyers and doctors and researchers and politicians. So I envision a future where the transgender community just is part of society. I have a child who was an artist from a very young age. In fact, we would go to a amusement park and she would insist in sitting in the stroller and drawing. There is no argument being made in society or a parenting guidebook that says that I should tell that artist at age 3 that they can't be an artist, that they may change their mind and not want to be an artist later in life. Society would think that that was really quite strange to do that to a child. But we do that with gender. We tell a young child who is expressing themselves in a non-conforming way that there's something wrong with them. We shame them into basically to coalesce into our idea of what gender is. And it is causing trauma to this community and has always caused trauma to the community. And it is within the last few decades that the professionals, the educators, the social workers, the medical professionals and practitioners are saying no more. We're not going to tell this community that they can't be who they say that they are from a very young age. That is inspiring. I think that it's time that we step aside and listen to this community and they have something to say about who they are, and we need to believe them. There's been a lot of research that's been done over the last 50 years, really, taking a look at parenting, early childhood development, which is the area that I research. And overall, if you were to condense all of that information down and take a look at it, families who support their children and their expressions fare much better than the families that don't. So the affirming families are keeping very strong connections with their children. There's not an emotional rejection from the child against the parents. Message that the parents send to the child is, you matter as you are. As you are expressing yourself, you matter immensely. And that strengthens the relationship as the child grows into adulthood. So this is documented in many books and articles and even in journal research papers. It's quite striking that when it comes to other human attributes, we tend to allow a child to develop into the person that they're going to be, except when it comes to gender. There's something about gender identity that causes a lot of fear, and I believe it has mostly to do with the some of the language that's coming online from groups who do not agree with that feel as though humans are either male or female, binary, that it cannot change. And when you frame your understanding about humanity in that binary, non-changing way, you tend to alienate children and the generation that is right now, young people who have a better understanding about humanity. They are alienated, and there is typically a split within the family when the family is non-affirming. Research that I do in early childhood development, I'm being mentored by Dr. Janice Kroeger at Kent State University. She has done a lot of work in early childhood development, specifically looking at teachers, not just parents. So the support networks through either the social work or through teachers really does provide some strength to children. And those support networks can be as simple as just when a child says, I want to be called Susie instead of Samuel, that is that not only does the research show that is the better route to go, but we're finding through qualitative research that is the better route to go. One of the things that we've learned is that a lot of the opposition to the gender-affirming healthcare is a social opposition, not medical. And so to overcome some of the barriers and the health disparities that are quite extensive, actually, is through education, providing opportunity for individuals to know a transgender person, to understand what the healthcare is all about. There's so much misinformation, and the perceptions just are not accurate. For example, one of the biggest one is that surgery is happening to young children, and that just is not true.
Kid goes to school and comes home a few days later with an operation. The school decides what's going to happen with your child. And many of these childs 15 years later say, what the hell happened?
And so that education piece is what I hope to address through some of the research that I do and some of the outreach. There is actually a very targeted disinformation campaign that is happening where the strategy is very similar to what happened with the tobacco industry. And so language is used in a way that will sway public opinion in a certain dimension. It does not have a full look at what we know about the transgender population, or even what we know about the gender-affirming healthcare. So I think the health disparities comes from that lack of information, a lack of good information. Organizations, the individuals who work in outreach, the barriers that they face have more to do with social. And so social ways of communicating and bringing people together to understand a community, especially a marginalized community, becomes so very important. Within the research journal, there is a lot of information about how disinformation tactics are used. And for example, the tobacco industry used very targeted marketing in putting out a narrative, a meta-narrative of how the tobacco industry had done research and that smoking was safe. The same type of tactics are being used against the transgender community with relation to the gender-affirming healthcare. And so this meta-narrative that the gender-affirming healthcare is not safe is part of that disinformation campaign. So one of the reasons that this legislation that is targeting right now, particularly for young people, is because it ties the hands of the teachers who could be a support person for a trans child that is not being affirmed at home. It ties the hands of a healthcare provider by taking away the tools that they have that have had decades of research behind it. And so it's really important that we understand that the legislation that is happening right now is detrimental to the transgender community in a very real way. That is a challenge that can be overcome through sharing good information, using support networks, using the nonprofit organizations that are in place who have done a really good job of pulling together the research that is out there and putting out counter narratives, essentially, that show how the transgender community is very resilient, that the gender affirming care that they receive has been helpful, it's beneficial for their thriving in their lives. For mental health, having hope is so very important. And for the transgender community, a lot of times that hope has been removed because they are in a society that does not accept them as they are. And sometimes they're in families that are struggling with who they are. And so that hope can wane. They can lose hope. They don't see themselves as an adult. I once heard a trans person say, a young adult say, I didn't think that I was going to make it to age 25. They really believe that they do not have any place in society in the future. And that takes a toll on the mental health for young people. And it's so important to have those support networks in place to show a trans person that you can make it past age 20. You can make it past age 25. And in fact, there are transgender individuals who are in their 60s right now, that they can have a long, full, engaging life that is fulfilling. The research even shows that if the individual has just one affirming person in their life, whether that be a teacher, a parent, a social worker, someone from the church who is affirming, that looks at them as a transgender young person and says, you are valued. We accept you as a transgender individual. 40%, the suicide rate goes down significantly just by having one person who values them as a transgender person. One of the things that I am pleased about being part of this project is it allows us to tell the stories of the transgender individuals, of the community itself, and that storytelling can be impactful. It's difficult to not understand a person if you have not had an opportunity to sit down with them. And because this population is only 1% of the entire population, not many people know a transgender person. And so any way that we can amplify their voices, being advocates ourselves, amplifying their voices, their lived experiences, any way that we can do that, and doing it through videos such as this, through movies, through a documentary, is one way for the general audience to have a better understanding of what it is like to be a transgender person, what challenges that they face, and how can we better support them, because they are part of humanity and have always been part of our society.